these things concerning your word. And again, we would ask you that you would join us this morning, Lord, and open each heart that we might come away better equipped to serve you. For we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Please have a seat. So I'm going to make an attempt to wrap up this series on Israel and Hamas today. And I want to talk about one more topic, which was the Abraham Accords, which Brother Mike touched on here recently in the sermon. And then I'll try to do it like a little summary of the last 10 weeks, and we'll move on. I'll try to pick up next week where we left off when we started this series. Okay, so who's heard of the Abraham Accords? Might know what they are. There was a lot of news about it here for a while, but it seems to have gotten a little quiet, right? And the reason is that it was a Trump initiative, and then nobody in the Biden administration wants to even talk about it, right? But as we're going to see here, although it was very highly political, they're still around. It's still very highly political. I don't think I can take away from the fact that it did accomplish some pretty important things. And I think it's things we kind of need to watch here in these last days. Particularly if Mr. Trump gets reelected, I think you're going to see these things come back to the fore, because it was one of his big accomplishments, supposedly, during his administration. So let's dive in. It says, the Abraham Accords are bilateral agreements on Arab-Israeli normalization, they call it, right? We have normal relations with one another. Signed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Israel and Bahrain on September 15th, 2020. It was mediated by the United States. Trump takes the credit for it, but who knows who the primary spokesperson for that was? The guy who kind of spearheaded the whole thing. It's his son-in-law by the name of Jared Kushner, right? Who happens to be Jewish, oh, by the way. So it was mediated by the U.S. UAE announced their agreement on the 13th of August, 2020, Bahrain in September. So on September 15th, 2020, the signing of the agreements was hosted by U.S. President Trump on the Truman balcony of the White House amid elaborate staging intended to evoke the signings of historic formal peace agreements in prior administrations. So clearly a political event. He was trying to say, my work here is just as important as Carter's was for the Camp David Accords, and Bush for Oslo, or the Oslo Accords, or vice versa. And even the signing of the peace agreements after World War II, and so on and so forth. So he was trying to kind of set the stage for how important he thought these things were. And indeed, like I say, I think they have their importance. So this is actually the declaration itself, and I want to read it to you. And it'll be 2 slides here. I couldn't get it all on one slide. But it's a pretty simple document. And on the surface, looks pretty academically milquetoast-like, right? Okay. But pretty significant when you think about these are Arab nations, primarily Muslim, who signed this agreement with Israel, right? So let's see what it says. It says that we, the undersigned, recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world based on mutual understanding and coexistence. You never heard a Muslim talk about coexistence with Israel, right? As well as respect for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. How many Muslim countries advocate religious freedom? It's approximately 0, So this is kind of a significant statement. It says, we encourage efforts to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue to advance a culture of peace among the 3 Abrahamic religions and all humanity. So we'll see here in a second. It was named the Abraham Accords because it focuses on the common belief, supposedly, between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity in Abraham, right? So it says, we believe that the best way to address challenges is through cooperation and dialogue, and that developing friendly relations among states advances the interests of lasting peace in the Middle East and around the world. We seek tolerance and respect for every person in order to make this world a place where all can enjoy a life of dignity and hope, no matter their race, faith, or ethnicity. Sounds a little like the U.S. Constitution, right? U.S. was involved with this, okay? But again, very significant you find an Arab country, much less a Muslim country, signing up for it. It goes on, says, we support science, art, medicine, and commerce to inspire humankind, maximize human potential, and bring nations closer together. We seek an end to radicalization and conflict. Specifically, referring to the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? To provide all children a better future. I'd like to think adults would be interested in a better future as well, but you have to get children in there because it's politically correct, right? It says, we pursue a vision of peace, security, and prosperity in the Middle East and around the world. The important part is in this spirit, we warmly welcome and are encouraged by the progress already made in establishing diplomatic relations between Israel and its neighbors in the region under the principles of the Abraham Accords. We are encouraged by the ongoing efforts to consolidate and expand such friendly relations based on shared interest and a shared commitment to a better future. Now, when you see these words amongst the politicians, right, shared interests and shared commitment, it generally translates into money sooner or later, okay? And so that's the way they sort of negotiate, right? But for all the political overtones, if you will, in it, I do think there are some very significant things that have occurred here. Particularly, you get two Arab nations, primarily Muslim, signing up formally and publicly to this kind of thing, right? So we'll look at that here in a second. But what were some of the motives? The UAE and Bahrain share similar motivations for signing the accords. These include securing peace in the region and a shared opposition toward Iran. We keep seeing Iran popping up all the time, right? And so now we have these Arab nations, Muslim nations, who are pushing back against Iran. Remember the ram in Daniel 8 was pushing west, north, and south, right? That was Iran. So they don't like what they're seeing. And these are Sunni Muslims, and Iran is Shiite, and so there's that conflict going on as well. But they're particularly concerned about Iran's nuclear ambitions to get a nuclear weapon, because Iran has publicly said they want the nuclear weapon so they can blow Israel off the face of the earth, right? Well, whereas some of the other Muslims might agree with that in concept, the neighbors there recognize that if they do that, all that fallout is going to affect all the neighboring countries as well. So, no, I don't think we want to do it with a nuclear weapon, right? So, anyway. It says, and they're wanting improved relations with the United States and Israel. Improved relations with the United States usually means money in one way or another, or some sort of political advantage, right? Instability in the region refers to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has created divisions between Arab nations, driven by, of course, Iran. The UAE and Bahrain claim that signing the accords will help improve stability due to potential free trade and economic advantages. However, other members of the Arab League, such as Qatar and Kuwait, refuse to recognize Israel until the Palestinian issue is resolved. The UAE and Bahrain were all opposed to the Iran nuclear deal and sided with the U.S. in fighting the Islamic regime. So if you've been watching that political football, President Obama cut this deal with Iran that essentially allowed them to go ahead with their nuclear research and ambitions, right? Trump came in and says, no, nada, not going to happen, right? And so it keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And now that Biden is in there, he's basically given them another ticket to continue. And some of the other Western countries are with him on that, right? Let's stop fighting about it, right? So, but these guys are particularly concerned about those guys getting a nuclear weapon. It says Donald Trump's role in mediating the agreements opened the doors for more economic and military support from the U.S. to the UAE and Bahrain, particularly naval and aviation resources. So there it is. We gave them weapons, we gave them money, we gave them things so they could sign this stuff, right? Now, aside from the, let's say, perhaps questionable political motives in some of it, I think the fact that these guys have stepped up publicly and done this is a major step. The optics of it are very, very important, I think, for us to watch. We'll see here in a second. It says, Trump helped mediate the accords and signed the documents with representatives for Israel, UAE, and Bahrain. The accords were signed at the White House, and facing re-election, Trump wanted to improve his role in international affairs, or his image to others, right, and how important he was on the international stage. And he shares similar beliefs regarding Iranian nuclear deal and the region's instability. His position also reflects the United States, its allies and interests, and complicated history in the region. So he wasn't alone, because a lot of the other Western countries that are allies with the U.S. didn't like that Iran nuclear deal either, right? And so they would like to do something to fix it, and this was one thing. So So as part of the two agreements, both the UAE and Bahrain recognized Israel's sovereignty. Big deal, big deal for an Arab League nation to publicly recognize Israel's sovereignty. Huge departure, we'll see here in a second. Enabling the establishment of full diplomatic relations. Israel's initial agreement with the UAE marked the first instance of Israel establishing diplomatic relations with an Arab country since 1994, when the Israel-Jordan peace treaty came into effect. So if you remember, after the 1967 war, we'll talk about that here in a second as well, all this conflict was still going on, but eventually Egypt and Jordan both signed peace agreements with Israel. And those were considered to be, monumental landmark events in history, and were. Right? Because they're not shooting at him anymore. Now, they'll be on the opposite side of the political table oftentimes, but they're not attacking, right? So that was a big step forward. It says the agreements were named Abraham Accords to highlight the common belief of Judaism and Islam in the prophet Abraham. So if you remember, this is a family feud. I'm going to do a little summary here at the end to kind of show you where that comes from again, just to remind you. But the significance of this thing is it's a reversal from this policy that was put together by the Arab League after the 1967 war, right? Because so the Arab leaders met after their stinging defeat by Israel in 1967 to discuss the future of the Middle East. They decided on this unified policy amongst all of the Arab League. They said no peace, no negotiations, and no recognition of Israel, the three no's. And that has sort of controlled this whole discussion ever since, right? But now we have two Arab League countries that stood up publicly and departed from that, right? They broke ranks with the Arab League and said, we are recognizing Israel's sovereignty. We're not going to shoot. We're going to seek peace, right? And we're going to seek economic cooperation, all that kind of stuff, which they've done. Since that time in 2020 when it was signed, there have been some fairly important technological, defense, and economic sorts of projects that have gone on between these countries where they're actually sharing ideas, sharing information, sharing wealth. In fact, folks are beginning to realize that Israel is probably the most financially secure country in the Middle East by a wide margin, right? And it's about to get worse as far as the other guys are concerned. Because you remember in the study of the Signs of the Times how they found all this oil over there under Israel in the Levant, right? And Israel's already started leasing those oil fields, and they're raking in the cash, right? And they're about to become as powerful economically based on the oil revenues as Saudi Arabia. They're talking about them taking over the number one position from Saudi Arabia for oil exports and revenues, right? So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that it would probably be a good idea to make friends with these folks because there's probably some economic advantage in doing so, okay? And they have seen it. UAE has seen it, and Bahrain has seen it, okay? And there's some others here as well, we'll see in a second. So in October of 2020, Israel and Sudan agreed to normalize ties. The agreement was unratified and is unratified as of 2024. So they made the agreement, and here's the interesting thing. As part of the agreement, the U.S. removed Sudan from its list of state sponsors of terrorism and gave it a $1.2 billion loan. Now, the U.S. is sometimes accused of buying their friends, right? And I would say there's not a small amount of truth to that, from time to time. And this is a good example. So they closed the deal. And they agreed to it, but their Congress or their government has not actually formally ratified it. So it kind of stands in this no man's land, But they got their $1.2 billion, so they're pretty happy, right? It says on January 6th, the government of Sudan signed the Abraham Accords Declaration in Khartoum, the capital there, Sudan. In December 2020, the Israel-Morocco normalization agreement was signed. In exchange for Morocco's recognition of Israel's sovereignty, the United States recognized Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, which has been a political football for a long time as well, right? So you see the political horse trading that's going on with this whole thing. And why some people look at it askance quite a lot. And if you're just looking at it from the natural perspective, I'd probably do that too, okay? But you can't separate the spiritual from the natural, I don't think, in this, right? So I think the mere fact that these Arab League countries have broken ranks with the Arab League in favor of this accord, I think it is a very significant landmark step in the timeline here. We'll get to here in a second. But in August 2021, this agreement, the Abraham Accords, was cited by Algeria as one of the reasons for unilaterally cutting relations with Morocco. So these Arab countries that are breaking ranks are losing some friends too, right? And Algeria, who's their neighbor, their big neighbor, basically says, we're not having any more to do with you, Morocco, because you normalized relations with Israel, all right? In November 2021, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, signed a joint security understandings agreement with Moroccan Defense Minister, I won't try to pronounce his name, the first time that Israel openly signed such an agreement with an Arab state. The agreement formalized the defense ties between the two countries, allowing for a smoother cooperation between the defense establishments. So some people will look at this thing and kind of go, well, but you know, we got UAE, we got Bahrain, we got Morocco, we got Sudan. None of those guys were shooting at Israel, and none of them probably will shoot at Israel. None of them are really the problem countries when it comes to Israel-Arab relations, right? So, what's the big deal, right? Well, the big deal, my personal opinion, the big deal is it sets a precedent. These are all Arab League countries who broke ranks and said, okay, guys, you guys go and fight if you want to. We want to have normal relations for the following reasons, right? And some of them are the U.S. paid us. Some of them are Israel's about to get rich, right? And we'd like to have some of that, right? So, but here's sort of the big plum. There was a time when they thought Saudi Arabia was going to come across. If Saudi Arabia actually signs up for this thing, that's going to be huge, huger than all the rest of them put together, shall we say, right? So it says a rapprochement, which is a fancy diplomatic word for reestablishment of cordial relations. We're not going to fuss at you anymore. We're going to be friendly with you. Between Israel and Sunni Arab states took place in the 2010s due to their shared fear of the Shiite Iran and its nuclear program. Like I say, nobody wants to see Iran nuke Israel, not because they like Israel, but because they know the fallout's going to fall on all of them, right? So they're not interested in that. But it says, by 2017, the unofficial cooperation with Saudi Arabia had been going on for at least 5 years, with intelligence services from both countries assisting each other and officials regularly sharing intelligence. By 2016, summits and conferences between high-ranking Israeli and Palestinian and Israeli Arab politicians and direct contacts between their security and intelligence services had not only become routine, but were openly discussed in major Arab media. So there is a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, whether they want to admit it or not, whether they want to make it public or not. And in fact, the new Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS, has been fairly vocal about trying to find peace, right? He has his own view of what that looks like, called the API. And so he has not actually signed up to these accords yet, but he hasn't been openly opposed to them either. And so he kind of sits on the fence right now. But if he were to sign this agreement, it would be a huge statement across the Arab countries, right? He has a little bit of a problem, though. We'll see here in a second, is that his citizens don't like it, okay? In fact, most of them are very, very much opposed to it. So he's taking the safe road, the very conservative road right now, and kind of staying in the middle. But this is one to watch. So we talk about watching. We're called upon to watch in Luke, right, in the end times. So you might ask what to watch for. This is one of them. Like I say, I think if Mr. Trump is reelected, you're going to see the Abraham Accords rise to the surface again. If he's not, they'll probably die a quiet death. However, the importance here is that these 4 countries that have already signed up have set a precedent, right, among Arab nations, however small it might be. It's a small foot in the door of the, an Arab nation can really get along with Israel if they try, and there might be some benefits in doing so, right? So in January 2020, Trump announced the Trump Peace Plan for the Middle East in a joint press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The plan provided for, and get this, I don't know if you've heard about this or not, but this is kind of a bold statement. It calls for a unified Jerusalem as Israel's capital and Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and the principal Jewish settlements in the West Bank, amounting to annexation of roughly 30% of the territory. I'll show you that here in a second. Okay. The Palestinians would get some desert areas near the Egyptian border, limited sovereignty, and non-contiguous state with numerous Israeli enclaves. So it's kind of a state within a state. I'll show you in a map here in a second. But it was pretty much ridiculed by all the Democrats and all the liberal media, especially including the New York Times, who said that rather than viewing it as a serious blueprint for peace, analysts called it a political document by a president in the middle of an impeachment trial, working in tandem with Mr. Netanyahu, a prime minister under criminal indictment who is about to face his third election in a year. So you had both presidents, if you remember, Mr. Netanyahu was indicted for criminal activity and bribes, and his wife was in stuff. And so the liberal side in Israel was just as much against him as the liberals in the U.S. were against Trump, right? And so both were sort of working at the same time there. They were making fun of the fact you got these two embattled presidents make this ridiculous deal that nobody else is going to sign up to, right? And nobody did. But let me show you what it looks like, because I think it's kind of interesting. The blue part here is what he proposed would go to the Palestinians, right? And you might remember, I'll show you another map here in a second, but right now in the West Bank, all of this territory over here is what the world would like to call occupied territory, okay, part of the West Bank. So he basically signs it over to the Israelis here along the Jordan River. And it's hard to see from back there probably, but this map is showing where these enclaves are. The little circles here are Jewish settlements within the West Bank that would be recognized as Israeli enclaves, okay? They get to continue to live there, even though the Arabs control the area. And on this side, it's showing some of the things that they were offering up here. This is a major high-tech manufacturing area, agriculture and stuff down here. And these little things are indicating access roads where you have free commerce going back and forth between the Arab interests and the Israeli interests and so on and so forth, right? So this is actually a plan that was put forward by Trump in tandem with the Abraham Accords that people generally laughed at, okay? But again, I think if he gets reelected, he might want to watch, because some of this stuff might come up again, right? So Trump was not reelected in 2020, right? And it says, after he left office in February 2021, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said that the United States will continue to urge other countries to normalize relations with Israel, and that normalization is not a substitute for Israeli-Palestinian peace. So this is the Biden administration talking. And the last thing they want to do is talk about anything positive with the Abraham Accords, right? Although they recognize that some positive things have happened with the Abraham Accord, but they don't want to give Trump any credit for any of that stuff, right? So we're not going to talk about the Abraham Accords. It says, we hope that Israel and other countries in the region join together in a common effort to build bridges and contribute to tangible progress towards the goal of advancing negotiated peace between Israelis and Palestinians. That statement could have been made every day for the last 100 years, right? It's just basically political mumbo-jumbo. But it says, Axios reported in March 2021 that the Biden administration supports widening the normalization process to other countries, and that it prefers the term normalization process to the Abraham Accords. Now, I wonder why that would be. I'd say there's two reasons. One is the Abraham Accords are attributed to Trump, and they're not going to give any credit to Trump for any reason. But I think there's another reason there, in that the term Abraham Accords harkens back to a God that is in charge of both, right? And none of the liberals, whether in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world, want to acknowledge such a thing, that there is an absolute God who's really in charge, right? They would rather believe that we politicians are in charge, right? And we're going to make it all right. I think we're going to show here, I think we've shown so far, I'm going to do in the summary here in a second, man's not going to be able to do that, okay? I think that's kind of folly. It's my own opinion. So what happened? The normalization agreements were criticized by citizens of the 4 Arab states that signed the accords, as well as many citizens of other Arab countries, especially because they failed to make progress resolving the Palestinian conflict. So I like to think about some of the logic here from time to time, right? They're basically saying, unless you fix this problem with the Palestinians, I can't be friends with you, is essentially what they're saying, right? We have no common ground. We have no way to gain in a relationship with one another because you won't fix the problem with the Palestinians to my satisfaction. Forget about what you want, but to my satisfaction, right? That's kind of what the message is being transmitted here. But so the criticism increased in May 2021 after violent protests erupted in Jerusalem. Hamas fired rockets into Israel, and Israel retaliated with airstrikes on Gaza. A Fatah Central Committee member said the Abraham Accords were one of the reasons for the October 7, 2023 attack, which started this series, oh, by the way. So when that attack happened, I decided to kind of start this series looking into Israel and Hamas. So Fatah is the political group from the Palestinian Authority, right? I said these accords were one of the reasons for the October 7 attack because they were so upset that some of these other countries had normalized relationships with Israel. So if so let's say Sister Grace and I don't get along, and suddenly we decide we are going to get along. We're going to be friends. You don't like the fact that we're friends, so you go shoot Sister Grace, or you shoot me. And I'm going, I'm not sure I'm tracking the logic here. I mean, exactly what is it you gain? Because the UAE signs an agreement with Israel. What does Hamas gain by shooting Israel at that point, other than some media attention, which they got, right? Okay. So if you talk about the civilian populace in these various countries, so the survey shows that in Arab countries that have signed the normalization agreements with Israel, the majority of citizens view the Abraham Accords negatively. Why do you suppose that would be? I would submit it's because that's what they're being told, right? That's what the media is putting out there, their media, right? Our media too, from time to time. It says, in November 2022, 76% of Saudi respondents said they had negative views of the Abraham Accords. And according to the poll conducted by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, 96% of Saudi participants believe that Arab nations should cut ties with Israel, and only 16% of Saudis said Hamas should accept a two-state solution. This is why MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi, hasn't signed anything yet, right? I mean, he could wind up with a revolt amongst his own populace if he did that, right? Even though he can see the benefit, right? He's a businessman too. But I thought it was kind of striking here that you got 84% of the Saudis said that Hamas should not accept a two-state solution. In other words, Israel should not exist. Hamas should get control of everything, right? I'm going, 86%. That's a lot, right? So this is among just the normal populace. Remember, the scriptures told us in the end times the whole world would be against Israel, right? And so I think it's happening. So we talk about this two-state solution. What is it? Well, several countries have pushed for more peace agreements in recent years. Many have suggested a two-state solution, but acknowledge that Israelis and Palestinians are unlikely to settle on borders. I would say amen to that. That argument's only been going on for 100 years. Literally 100 years, 102 to be exact, right? It says the United States is one of Israel's closest allies. In a visit to Israel in May 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump urged Netanyahu to embrace peace agreements with the Palestinians. And in May 2018, the U.S. Embassy relocated from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which Palestinians perceived as a signal of American support for Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, again, just a reminder, a little bit of a history here, right? This was a huge, big thing, and I think a positive thing at the time. But Trump was criticized for being this rogue, radical, warmonger kind of a guy to do that, right? The U.S. Congress had passed a resolution saying that should happen in the 1990s, okay? And no president had the intestinal fortitude to actually go make it happen because he was afraid of the backlash from the Arabs in the region, right? This was not Trump's original idea, although he took advantage of it, quite frankly, and made the headlines. But this had been a law on the books in the U.S. for 20 years, before he actually went and made it happen. So the Palestinians responded with protests in the Gaza-Israel border, which were met with Israeli force, resulting in the deaths of dozens of protesters. So we find this more and more. We'll talk about here in just a second. I'd like to give you a little summary of the last 10 weeks here to leave you with this series, because we're told in the scriptures to watch in the end times. And obviously the question is, what do we watch for? Well, when Jesus talked about watching, he gave us a list of things to look for in the end times, okay? But there were multiple Old Testament prophecies, which we've talked about here in Daniel and Obadiah, and there are others, that tell us what the end times look like. So we know we're in the end times, right? So I think we've shown at least two of those that affirm, once again, we are in the end times, as described in the Old Testament prophecies, okay? And the New Testament tells us to watch when we find ourselves in the end times. So if we go back to the beginning of this thing, I find it interesting. When the Lord first gave this property to the children of Israel, he told them to go in and take over and kill every man, woman, and child, and so on. There was the whole Joshua conquest, right, to take over the land. But he was supposed to do it slowly, little by little, right? And God actually directed that. Said, let the beast take over the land and things like that, right? So he takes over, he hasn't finished the job. And you might recall that he got deceived at one point when certain folks came to him and said, hey, we come from a far country, we don't want any trouble, and we want a pact with you that you won't attack us, you won't hurt us, anything like that. So Joshua agrees. It turns out these people were from what is today called the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, okay? He cuts a deal with them, but as he is about to leave the scene, he's telling the guys that are coming after him, you have a job to finish here, okay? And you need to do it the way God told you to do it. And he says, take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves that ye love the Lord your God, else if ye do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, make no pact with them, right? Even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them and go in unto them and they unto you. This is one of the sources we get about not marrying unbelievers, but there's others as well. It says, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, scourges in your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord God hath given you. And I would say that's been going on ever since. It goes on today, right? We watch the fulfillment of this prophecy every day, right? So this is the family feud, right? So as we talked about in the early stages of this series here, this is a war between the sons of Jacob and the sons of Esau. The sons of Esau basically being the Edomites, which is in southern Israel, and those in currently the Gaza Strip are predominantly Edomites. Now there's been obviously some mixtures over the years, but for the most part, they are the descendants of Esau. And the Israelis, the descendants of Jacob. And then we have the Iranians, from the territory was once called the Medo-Persia, right, are the sons of Ishmael, right? So this is the family feud, and they're still fighting today, right? Dr. Corman here had a good commentary, I thought, on the book of Obadiah and the fact that it is a prophecy, Old Testament prophecy about today, right? And he says, Obadiah verse 10 says, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. We've talked about the fact that this word violence is translated from the Hebrew word Hamas. And Hamas in Hebrew means not only violence, but violence for the sake of violence. It's violence because you love to see somebody else suffer, right? The worst kind of violence, if you will, right? And as I said, I think the Arabs are very well aware that this word exists in Hebrew. Okay, I don't think that name Hamas was an accident, right? So God hated the Edomites because they attacked their brothers during the Babylonian captivity. So when Nebuchadnezzar came in and took over, remember God raised up Nebuchadnezzar for that purpose. He sends them in there. He had a plan. He was expecting a certain number of the Israelites to escape, but the Edomites stepped up and killed them. They laid ambushes for them at the crossroads and so on and so forth. They either killed them or turned them over to to the Babylonians. And God says, he's not forgiving that. He says, thou shalt be cut off forever. He said, violence was against the brother Jacob. You'll be covered with shame and slaughtered, and there will be no survivors. You'll be cut off from God and his blessings forever. So I think from the outside looking in, if you were to look at Islam, and particularly those people in that region, because God said he was going to make them desolate, right? They've been desolate. They've been small, insignificant, which Obadiah also said was going to happen, right? Here's what I think kind of the rub is in this whole thing, and kind of keep in the back of our mind, right? It was this fellow Balfour, who was the British foreign affairs minister, I guess it was, that came up with this idea for the two-state solution back in 1922. And he wrote it down. It became known as the Balfour Declaration. And the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN, basically ratified it and approved it in 1922. Okay? And this is what it looked like to him. The orange was to be Israel. The yellow was to be the Arab states. Okay? And it kind of bubbled along, nobody really doing anything with it except talking about it for another 45 years, right? Until 1947, when the United Nations put it forward to create the nation of Israel. We'll talk about that in a second. But we say, what's different? Well, let me go to this slide first, because I think I messed this up here. It was in 1967, after the 67 war, the UN passed this resolution 242, right? Which kind of laid out this whole two-state thing, and you guys go here and you guys go there and be nice and play in the sandbox and so on and so forth, right? And the Israelis actually supported the resolution because it called on the Arab states to accept Israel's right to live in peace and within secure and recognized boundaries from threats of active force. In other words, recognize our sovereignty as a nation and our right to exist as a nation, okay? And it called for that. So Israel accepted this resolution, right? The Arabs did not accept it, right? Well, the same thing happened. I'm going to go back one here, sister. The same things happened in 1947, because when the UN put forth this plan with the two-state solution, if you will, right, and it kind of laid out those boundaries, and Israel said, we'll take it. And the Arabs said, not only no, but, okay? But because the United Nations sort of authorized it, Israel went ahead and stood up as a nation according to those boundaries, okay? Immediately the Arab countries attacked, okay, and tried to wipe them off the face of the earth. Well, Israel won a very decisive war, right? And so here's what's different today. Normally that would have settled things. You know, you go to war, you smack each other around, and the winner is the winner, right? And he gets to call the shots after you're done. What's different today is that has never been allowed to happen. So there was never a surrender from the Arab side, and therefore the rest of the world for some reason didn't actually recognize the Israeli victory, at least not in the same way that a war in the past would have. After World War II, when the Allies won, they took the spoils, they drew all the lines. They said, here's where the countries exist and where they don't, right? They get to do that as the victor, okay? Israel was not allowed to do that, okay? So when Israel pushed the Arabs back for their own security to certain lines, which basically are the same ones today, a little bit changes from that time, but basically pushed them back, drew the lines, but nobody wanted to recognize those lines, and they're calling that territory occupied territory, as though it is illegal, right? Well, we'll let the lawyers battle out over what's legal and what's not, but had anyone else done that, they would have gotten to draw the lines, right? So they didn't do that, and he makes an important statement. This guy lives in Israel. He's Jewish by his raising, but a Christian, and so he teaches Christianity from the point of view of the ancient Hebrew and Greek, right? But he says basically, you can provide aid and help to this other country after the surrender, but not before. I mean, if you give them aid before they surrender, you're just helping them to keep fighting, right? So you have to stop the fighting first, and then you can go in and provide the aid. And the example again is World War II. I mean, we pretty much schwacked Germany and Japan, okay, the Allies. But after they surrendered, we went back and rebuilt them. And they're some of the biggest economic powerhouses in the world today because we got to provide the aid after they surrendered. But you don't do that after one surrenders. So we find this happens over and over and over again, and this is just a good example of what I was trying to get to here, is that a conflict will start. Usually the Arabs will shoot Israel or do something. Israel responds, and this conflict starts. The UN steps up and goes, we got a good idea. You guys stop fighting, by the way, and you go here and you go there and so on and so forth. And Israel will go, okay, we're going to try to comply to the extent we can. They haven't complied with everything, to be fair. But for the most part, I mean, they've always held on to Jerusalem after the 67 war, you know. That's been a demand forever. And they said, no, Jerusalem's ours, not on the table, right? But anything else that basically says, you get those guys to recognize our sovereignty, our right to exist, and get them to stop shooting at us, and we're good with it, okay? So they'll accept it, the other side does not, and they keep shooting, and the conflict continues. So it's just a pattern that goes on and on. We're going to see it here soon, I think, in the current Israeli-Hamas war. The UN is going to step up and say, we got another idea, okay? You guys stop fighting. But this one is a little different. We'll get to it in just a second. This is a big sticking point that we talked about here in the series about the Israeli settlements. Huge argument, okay? And again, if you take the spiritual side of it out, I think you can find grounds for complaints, if you will, on just the natural side, right? But these folks who are settling here, and these purple dots represent the settlements, and the square ones are outposts, or little smaller communities, right? But those people who are settling there are basically Orthodox Jews who believe God gave them the land and told them to possess the land. So they're going and doing what they think God told them to do, right? Regardless of what the rest of the politicians think, right? And so it's a huge controversy. The white areas here are under Israeli civil and military control, okay? The green parts are under Palestinian control. So if you notice, there aren't any dots in the green parts, right? Israel is allowing the settlements in the white parts, which is the parts that they control. Under international agreement, oh, by the way, they're under international agreement, they're allowed to have control of these areas, although they're not allowed to claim them as their own. They have civil and security control, right? So that's what's going on. Now, where it gets a little ticklish is, so let's say I'm an Orthodox Jew and I take my family out there to set up housekeeping in the land that I think God gave us, right? And so maybe I go purchase the land from the Arabs and I own it. And so it's a perfectly legitimate thing for me to do. I could go to another country and buy some land and live there if I wanted to, right? But where it gets sticky is oftentimes those kinds of things are subsidized by the Israeli government, right? And then they grow, they become big communities, and they're more subsidized by the Israeli government. And it gets to the point where in some cases, the Israeli government builds a whole blooming town, a whole city, right? And so people complain about it, and you're going to hear more about settlements. That is probably the biggest single sticking point in the whole negotiation process is get your Jews out of my Palestinian territory. And who said it was yours? Nobody's agreed that it's yours yet, right? So that's where it goes. We talked about the prophecy in Daniel chapter 8 about the ram and the goat, the ram being Iran. In the end times, is going to push to the west, the north, and the south, and we're seeing that happen. We've been seeing it for quite some time now, okay? It's going on. But eventually, the Antichrist is going to stand up as symbolized by the goat, and he's going to overcome the ram. But he's not going to do it by military conquest. It's going to be by flatteries, the scripture calls it, right? He's going to be this man of peace. He's going to be the hero that comes in and actually makes the peace process work. There's going to be some kind of a peace deal that happens in the Middle East, and they're going to subdue Iran in so doing, right? So that brings us to what started this series to begin with, which is the attack on the October 7th of last fall. They had this surprise attack on Israel, killed some 1,200 Israelis and kidnapped about 240 hostages, about half of which are still in captivity today, and the war goes on. But here's kind of the thing that is different. On the next day, Benjamin Netanyahu actually officially declared war. This is different from, hey, this guy shot me and I'm shooting back. Or I'm going to go over and take care of this terrorist enclave over here. It's mostly a law enforcement sort of a mission, right? I'm going to go take out these terrorists that are shooting at me. I haven't declared war on that government, right? This is different. He has formally, to the international community, said, I am officially declaring war against Hamas. And so when he says, this is not over until they are eliminated, he means it. And he gets to say so because he did that, right? This is different from just a clash. This is a war, all right? So an important thing to watch as this thing unfolds is what happens with the war. Now, if Hamas were to surrender, that is a way to stop a war, okay? Somehow I'm not thinking that's going to happen, okay? So very quickly, I'm almost out of time here, but today they're still fighting, obviously, and they have these major sticking points. Both sides claim Jerusalem as their capital. Both sides are at odds over the settlements and so on and so forth, and both of them blame each other for the terrorist attacks, all right? But today, 135 of 195 nations in the UN publicly support the Palestinians, okay? And those are the ones who just say so publicly, right? Not the ones that are kind of in the background. So I'd like to finish up here with this prophecy in Obadiah, and I'll try to summarize here, so we talked about it last week. But basically, he says, and this is Obadiah talking, that this is a prophecy for the end times. The last verse says it's for the end times. We'll get to that in a second. But it's basically saying that Israel is going to possess the Mount of Esau. It's going to possess the land of the Philistines, which is essentially the Gaza Strip and north of there. It's going to possess the fields of Samaria, which is the West Bank, and Gilead, which is northern Jordan. Okay? Furthermore, it says they're going to possess northern Lebanon, and the people who had fled earlier in the diaspora to France will come back and possess northern Lebanon, and those who went to France will possess the Negev. Basically saying Israel's borders are going to expand. I don't think we're going to see a two-state solution, right? So the very last verse says, after all these things that he talks about in Obadiah have happened, after all that's happened, then the kingdom should be the Lord's, meaning he will set up his kingdom after all that stuff. So rather than seeing Israel being broken up into little states, I think Obadiah is telling us the borders are going to expand. And of course, Brother Branham tells us, watch Israel. So watch where Israel is. You see the time figure where you're at. See, just watch these signs and wonders. If your eyes is open, see where we're at. So we're instructed to watch in the last days. Brother Branham says, if you want to know where we are on God's timeline, watch Israel, right? So I would just encourage you to watch the news. This story isn't over yet. Okay. With that, we'll close. Lord Jesus, we do thank you once again for your word. We thank you that it is absolute and we can count on it, Lord. We pray that you would always keep us sensitive to those things that are going on around us so we know how we can apply that word and how we can serve you best in these last days. We'd ask once again that you'd open our hearts as bread of life is broken to us from the pulpit, that we would come away better equipped to serve you. For we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Sorry I kept you a little late this morning.